1 month after I buried my only son, I drove up the mountain to stop his clock. That was the tradition in our family. When someone passes, you still the pendulum by hand. I had done it myself the morning of the funeral, but when I stepped through the door of that cabin, the clock was ticking. Someone had wound it back to life. And Men. Why? What I heard through those walls told me exactly who and why my son never came home. Take a breath with me. Before this journey begins, please drop a comment and share where you are tuning in from today. Your support by liking and subscribing helps these stories reach more hearts. While some details are creatively adapted for storytelling and your reflection, the core lesson is what I truly hope stays with you. 1 month after I buried my son, I was driving up the mountain road in full dark, telling myself the only reason I was going was to drain the water lines before the freeze. My name is Arthur Bellamy. People who have known me long enough call me Art. I am 68 years old, a retired watchmaker. The kind of man who has spent 45 years listening to the insides of things most people only read from the outside. I have rebuilt movements older than my grandfather. I have held gears smaller than a grain of rice between my fingertips and set them into position with a steadiness my surgeon once said he envied. I say this not to boast. I say it because steadiness is the thing I built my life around. And in the 3 weeks since they put Nathan in the ground, my hands had not been steady once. The cabin on Green Mountains was mine to winterize. That was the practical truth. I needed to drain the water lines before the hard freeze set in. I needed to check the seals on the north-facing windows, the ones that catch the full weight of the January wind, and I needed to inspect the chimney cap where the ice had loosened the caulk the previous year. These were real tasks. They needed doing. I told myself that on the drive up. I told myself that twice. Nathan Bellamy was 36 years old when he set out on the long trail for the last time. He was a clinical pharmacist at the regional hospital, a man who understood what a milligram meant the way I understand what a tenth of a millimeter means inside a watch case. Precision was the vocabulary we shared when other words failed us. He had been hiking that section of the long trail since he was 14 because I had taken him myself. We had covered every mile of that ridge together. I knew the trail the way I know the inside of a 1902 Waltham pocket watch. Every switchback, every place where the footing narrows and the wind finds you before you are ready. He went up on a Saturday. They found him Sunday afternoon on the eastern slope below the summit. The medical examiner filed his report within 48 hours. Sudden cardiac event, an undiagnosed clot that traveled to his brain at altitude under exertion. The case closed in 11 days. The examiner was sympathetic and thorough and entirely satisfied. I thanked him. I drove home. I sat in my workshop for 3 weeks and tried to find the version of myself that knew what to do next. My hands would not stop trembling. I picked up a mainspring I had been fitting into a bracket clock the week before Nathan died. A repair I had performed 1,000 times, and I could not hold the spring steady enough to seat it. The tweezers shook between my thumb and forefinger, as though the connection between my hands and my intention had been severed at a frequency I did not know how to restore. The drive up was not simple. I pulled over twice in the first 12 miles. Once because my grip on the wheel was unreliable, and once because the road through my headlights looked exactly like the road I had driven with Nathan beside me so many times that I could not separate the memory from the pavement. Grief does that. It makes the past and the present occupy the same space, and it does not ask permission. The road from Bennington climbs 9 miles of gravel after the last paved intersection, through stands of sugar, maple, and white birch that close in tight enough for the headlights to catch the pale trunks strobing past like a metronome. I know that road by its sounds, the way gravel shifts pitch when the grade steepens, the rattle of the front suspension on the frost-heaved stretch below the second switchback. The road was not what was difficult that morning. Do you know what grief does to a man who has spent his life listening to the insides of things? It turns every silent room into a clock that has stopped, and he cannot find the fault. Every surface he fitted and polished and set true becomes a record of hours he cannot return to. I had built the cabin over 3 summers, Most weekends with Nathan beside me from the time he could hold a level steady. He had opinions about the window placement, and was right about two of them. We argued for an entire afternoon about where to mount the pendulum clock, and I let him win because he was 22 and had just calculated the resonance frequency of the wall stud spacing to find the optimal point, and his pride in that arithmetic was something I could not bring myself to overrule. He was right about that too. The clock kept time on that wall for 14 years. The tree line broke at the last curve, and I heard it through the sealed windows and the cold November air that held no other sound at that elevation. Faint, but unmistakable. The steady pulse of a pendulum I had stilled with my own hand 5 weeks earlier, pressing my palm flat against the brass disc until its arc died and the cabin went silent. Tick, tick, tick. I had stopped that clock myself. I had reached through the glass case on the morning of the funeral and held the pendulum until the weight of my grief and the weight of the brass were indistinguishable, and then I had locked every door and window and driven away without turning back. Someone had opened the case. Someone had turned the key and set the pendulum swinging in a cabin, sealed since the day we buried my son. I stood on the porch with my hand against the doorframe and listened to Nathan's clock tick through the walls of the house I had built for him, and the cold worked through my jacket into my chest and settled beside something that was no longer grief alone. I did not open the front door. A man who has spent 45 years repairing delicate mechanisms learns certain things about thresholds. You do not force a case open before you understand what is running inside it. You listen first. You observe the amplitude of the sound, the regularity of the interval, whether the beat is clean or whether there is a drag somewhere in the train that tells you the problem is deeper than the surface. I stepped off the porch and moved along the eastern wall of the cabin, keeping to the shadow of the maple stand where the November frost had packed the ground firm and silent. My breath turned to vapor and disappeared. The cold was in my fingers already. I had not brought gloves because I had not imagined, when I left Bennington before 5 in the morning, that I would be standing outside the sealed walls of my dead son's cabin, in the dark, with a reason to be quiet about it. The side window of the living room sits 4 feet above the foundation line. I had framed it myself during the second summer and set the glass at a slight inward angle because Nathan had read somewhere that angled glass reduces interior reflection and makes it harder to see in from outside at night. He was 14 when he told me that. I had not thought about it in years. I thought about it now, standing beneath it, because the angle he had chosen meant that the firelight from inside reached the ground at my feet without casting my shadow back against the glass. Through the window, the pendulum clock was visible on the far wall, its brass disc swinging in the steady arc I had calibrated myself when we first mounted it. The fire was lit in the hearth I had laid stone by stone during the 3rd summer. The flames low and settled. The kind of fire that has been burning for hours and has been fed by someone who knows where the wood is kept. In the chair nearest the fire, there was a woman. She had her feet tucked beneath her. She had a glass of something on the side table to her right, catching the firelight from the angle that firelight has always caught glass in that room because I built that hearth, and I know how its light moves across every surface. She was entirely at ease. Not the ease of a guest, but the ease of someone who has stopped thinking about where the glasses are kept. I want to tell you what it felt like to see the pocket watch. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to describe because the facts of it are simple, and the weight of them is not. Through that window, I saw Diane Bellamy, my daughter-in-law, Nathan's wife, 34 years old, the woman who had wept against my shoulder in the church parking lot and told me she could not bear to return to this cabin because it held too much of him. She was wearing the silver pocket watch I had restored for my son on a chain around her neck. I had spent 6 months restoring that watch. It was an 1897 Elgin open face, the case worn smooth by a century of handling, the movement so fouled with old oil and dust that most repairers would have written it off as beyond recovery. I rebuilt it gear by gear because Nathan had found it at an estate sale and brought it to me with the expression of a boy who has discovered something he believes only his father can bring back to life. He was right. I replaced the hairspring. I polished every wheel in the train. I adjusted the regulator until the watch gained less than 2 seconds per day, which for a movement of that age is as close to perfect as the mechanism allows. I gave it to him on the day he graduated from pharmacy school. He turned it over in his hands with the slow attention of a man who understands what 6 months of work looks like. And he found the tiny scratch on the dial at the 4 o'clock position, a mark I had chosen not to polish out because it was part of the watch's history. Nathan looked at that scratch and said it gave the watch character. And he meant it. The watch was on Diane's neck. She reached for her glass with the ease of a woman entirely at home. Entirely without urgency. In a room where she had told me she could not bear to be. And then a second figure moved through the hallway behind her. Broad-shouldered, unhurried, crossing from the back hall into the kitchen with the certainty of a man who knows the floor plan without needing to think about it. He did not pause at the threshold. He did not orient himself the way a person does when entering a room that does not belong to them. He moved through my son's house as though the house had already changed ownership, and the paperwork was merely a formality the world had not yet processed. He crossed to where Diane was sitting and placed his hand on the small of her back. That gesture told me everything I needed to know about the duration of this arrangement before I had identified who he was. That hand was not the hand of a man new to this room. That hand had rested there many times. In this room, beside this fire, under this roof that I had framed. And my son had helped me shingle in the rain because we ran out of daylight, and he refused to leave a job half-finished. Then he turned toward the kitchen light. I need you to understand what Victor Stahl looked like at my son's funeral before I tell you what I saw through that window. Because what I am about to describe only carries its full weight if you hold both images at once. Victor Stahl was 41 years old, a cardiologist at the same hospital where Nathan worked. Broad-shouldered and composed, the kind of man who occupies exactly the right amount of space without appearing to calculate it. He had flown back from a conference for the service. He had stood at the lectern in the church and read a passage about time healing all wounds. And his voice had not wavered. He had gripped my hand with both of his at the graveside and told me Nathan was the finest mind in any room he entered. I had believed him. I had been grateful for it. 10 years. He had worked alongside my son for 10 years. My hand went flat against the cabin wall. The cold of the wood came through my palm, and I held it there because I needed something solid under my hand while the ground beneath everything I understood about the last 5 weeks shifted without warning. I stepped back from the window without making a sound. I am a watchmaker. That is not only what I did for a living. It is how I process the world. When a clock comes to me broken, the first thing I do is nothing. I hold it. I listen. I turn it slowly and let gravity tell me where the weight has shifted, where something has come loose or seized or fractured in a way that will not reveal itself to a man in a hurry. The diagnosis always precedes the repair, and the diagnosis always begins with stillness. I stood in the dark 10 feet from the window I had just stepped away from, and I was still. The cold had worked entirely through my fingers now. My breath came in slow, measured intervals, the kind of breathing that produces no visible vapor against glass, which is something you learn when you have spent decades working with surfaces that fog if you exhale too close. I was not thinking about breathing. My body was managing the mechanics while my mind was occupied with something else. What my mind was doing was running the arithmetic of 10 years. 10 years of shared work at the hospital. 10 years of department meetings and holiday gatherings. And the particular proximity that builds between two men who occupy the same professional corridor 5 days a week. 10 years during which Victor Stahl had known my son's schedule, my son's habits, my son's medication routines. 10 years during which Nathan had trusted him the way you trust a colleague who has never given you a single reason to question the trust. What do you do when you are standing in the dark outside a window and what you have seen cannot be undone by anything you do next? I want you to sit with that question for a moment because I sat with it for a long time in the cold, and the answer I arrived at is the only reason this story has an ending worth telling. I could have gone to the door. I could have knocked on it. I could have walked into the cabin I had built with my own hands and stood in the living room and asked 2 people who had attended my son's funeral to explain what they were doing in his chair by his fire wearing his watch. They would have explained it. They would have had an explanation ready, because people who do what they were doing do not arrive at a dead man's locked cabin without having rehearsed the possibility of being seen. There is a mistake that men make when they are angry, and I've watched it happen on enough job sites and in enough repair shops to know its shape before it arrives. The mistake is action without diagnosis. It is the equivalent of opening a watch case and reaching for the first gear that looks wrong without understanding the relationship between that gear and every other gear in the train. You remove it, and something else fails. You adjust it, and the timing shifts in a direction you did not anticipate. You apply force to a mechanism that requires precision, and you leave the movement in worse condition than you found it. A watchmaker does not repair with a hammer. He repairs with patience and with the understanding that every component he touches is connected to every other component, and that the sequence in which he works matters as much as the work itself. I was not going to open that door. I was not going to announce myself or confront them or give them any opportunity to adjust their story before I understood the full mechanism of what I was looking at. What I had seen through that window was a surface indication, the equivalent of a clock running 2 minutes fast. It told me something was wrong. It did not tell me where the fault originated, how deep it ran, or how many other components were compromised. I needed to see the movement. I needed to open the case from the back. The workshop sat 40 feet behind the main cabin, a separate structure I had built in the second summer, specifically to house the watchmaking bench and the tools that required climate stability. It was connected to the cabin by a covered walkway I had added later, but it had its own entrance from the east side, its own lock, and its own electrical panel that ran independent of the cabin's main system. I had designed it that way because precision instruments require isolation from the vibrations and temperature fluctuations of a living space, and because I had learned over 45 years that the best work happens in rooms that are built for nothing else. There was something in that workshop that Diane and Victor did not know about. I moved along the tree line without sound, keeping to the packed frost beneath the maples where my boots made no impression the eye could find in daylight. 45 years of handling objects that weigh less than a paperclip teaches your body a particular relationship with silence. You learn to distribute your weight evenly. You learn to set each foot down the way you set a gear onto its arbor, with control and without impact. You learn that the steadiest hand is the one attached to the steadiest body, and that steadiness begins in the feet. The workshop door was 30 feet ahead of me through the dark. I had the key in my hand already, retrieved from my jacket pocket without conscious decision, the way my fingers find the winding key of any clock I have serviced before. Muscle memory, which is the most honest kind of knowing. The cold was real now. The kind of cold that finds the spaces between your knuckles and settles there like a permanence. My hands were bare, and the temperature was somewhere in the low 20s, and the bark of the nearest maple was rough and frozen when I steadied myself against it to look back once at the cabin. The living room window still glowed amber. The shapes inside it had not changed. Diane had not moved from the chair. Victor had not appeared again at the glass. They did not know I was here. They did not know what I was about to find. And they did not know that the man standing in the dark 30 feet from a workshop door was not a grieving old man who had come to drain the water lines. He was a watchmaker who had just heard a mechanism running that should have been still, and who understood that the only way to know what was driving it was to open the case from the back and look at what was hidden behind the face. I crossed the last 30 feet to the workshop door. The key found the lock on the first turn, the way it always had. The way I had built it to. I opened the door and stepped inside, and pulled it shut behind me without letting the latch click, and I stood in the absolute dark of a room that smelled of clock oil and pine dust, and the particular stillness of a space that has been waiting. The workshop held its cold the way a watch case holds its silence. Not the moving cold of outdoor air, but the settled cold of a sealed space that has absorbed the temperature of the mountain into its walls and kept it. I stood without touching anything and let my eyes adjust. The shapes came slowly. The workbench along the west wall. The magnification lamp clamped to its edge. The rows of watch movements in their labeled trays, each one a small universe of interlocking intention waiting for hands that had not been steady enough to touch them in 5 weeks. Nathan's drafting notes were still pinned above the parts cabinet. 3 sheets of graph paper in his precise pharmacist's hand, marking measurements for a clock case modification he had been designing. I had not asked him about it because I was waiting for him to show me himself. A pencil lay on the bench at an angle that meant he had set it down mid-thought and intended to return. The room was a record of a man who had stepped out and not come back. I gave myself 60 seconds. That is the number I had settled on, somewhere between the window and this door. 60 seconds to let the room be what it was, to feel what it required me to feel. I counted the way I count anything that matters, roughly, honestly, without rushing the number. At the end of 60 seconds, I crossed to the east wall. The recessed panel was exactly where I had left it. Flush with the wall surface, the seam barely visible unless you knew what to look for, which no one ever had because I had built it myself and painted it myself, and had not mentioned it to anyone when I installed it the previous February. I had wired this panel on a Saturday morning while Nathan made coffee in the cabin and called through the wall to ask whether I needed help with the conduit routing. I told him I had it handled. He said he doubted that, and I could hear him smiling through the drywall. The system behind the panel was not surveillance in the way that word is usually meant. I am a watchmaker, not a security contractor. What I had installed was a documentation system, 4 small cameras, and a set of ultra-sensitive microphones originally designed for acoustic diagnostics, the kind I used to listen to a movement running inside its case and identify faults by sound alone. I had mounted them throughout the cabin and workshop the previous winter for insurance documentation purposes to record the condition of the antique movements and tools stored in the workshop in case of fire or theft. The microphones were sensitive enough to pick up the tick of a pocket watch from across a room. They were more than sensitive enough to pick up a human voice from the adjoining living room through a shared wall. The key was behind the junction box on a ledge I had framed specifically for it. My hand found it before my eyes did. The panel opened on its pivot, and there it was. A compact recording hub the size of a thick hardcover book, its amber indicator light pulsing in the dark with the slow, regular rhythm of a system with power and storage, and an active recording state. The system had never gone offline. Through 31 days of cold and silence, through the funeral and the locked cabin, and every morning I had spent in Bennington, staring at a mainspring I could not hold steady, this unit had been running. I connected the monitor cable to the small screen mounted inside the panel door. The file counter loaded in stages. 4 camera zones, all active, all with continuous footage. The timestamp range appeared. The earliest file was dated the day after Nathan's funeral. The most recent was timestamped this morning, 31 days. Nathan had been gone for 31 days, and someone had been here for nearly all of them. I navigated to the earliest file and pressed play. The monitor flickered once. A grainy, wide-angle image of the living room resolved slowly. The fireplace lit, the couch occupied by 2 figures sitting close together in the way people sit when they have forgotten to think about the distance between them. I recognized them both before the image finished sharpening. The footage from 4 days after the funeral showed Diane at the front door with a key already in the lock. She did not fumble. She did not check twice the way a person checks with a borrowed key. She inserted it and turned it in one clean motion and walked inside without pausing. I had built that lock. I know its tolerances. The specific resistance at the second pin, the quarter turn that releases the bolt. The key she used moved through the mechanism without any of the corrections a rough copy requires. Someone had cut it from a clean impression, deliberately, precisely, before Nathan was in the ground. 40 minutes later on the recording, Victor's car appeared at the edge of the frame. He parked where the gravel widens past the walkway, the same spot I park when I want clear access to the workshop, which meant he knew the property well enough to have a preference. He did not knock. The door opened from inside before he reached the steps. 7 visits across October and November. 7 evenings in a dead man's cabin, while his father sat in a workshop 11 miles south, trying to hold a mainspring steady. On the 4th visit, I heard Diane laugh. Not the careful laugh of someone aware of where she was. A full, unguarded laugh. The kind that means the body has stopped performing. I had heard that laugh before. I had told Nathan once that Diane had a good laugh. The kind that meant she was actually listening. I had been right about the laugh. I had been wrong about everything it surrounded. She said, "Nobody checks. Not even his father." Victor said, "Then we have all the time we need." On the sixth visit, Victor leaned forward and spoke in a lower register. The microphones almost missed. I turned the volume up 2 notches. The audio sharpened. He said a number, $3.5 million. Then he said a phrase I did not recognize but wrote down immediately in the notebook Nathan had given me for my 66th birthday, the one with the leather cover and the pencil loop on the spine. Nathan had written inside the front page, "For the measurements that count." I wrote the number beneath his handwriting. I circled it. Then I circled the phrase Victor had used, contestability window, and drew a line connecting the 2 circles, the way I connect components on a repair diagram, the elements that must function together, or the entire mechanism fails. I was ready to leave. I had copied the November footage onto the thumb drive I keep in the drawer beneath the monitor, the one I use for off-site backups of workshop inventory files. The progress bar had reached 100%. I had what I came for, or what I believed I had come for, which at that point in the night, I still understood as fraud, insurance fraud, financial conspiracy, the language of money moving through channels it was never meant to travel. I was reaching for the monitor cable to disconnect it when my hand stopped. Not because I decided to stop it, because my eye caught the scroll bar at the bottom of the file directory, and the scroll bar was not at the bottom. There were files beneath the ones I had reviewed. Older files. Files from before the funeral. From before Nathan died. From the weeks and months when my son was still alive and walking through this cabin and making coffee in the kitchen and arguing with me through the walls about things that did not matter and mattered more than either of us knew. I scrolled down. The archive extended back through October, September, August, July. Months of continuous recording that I had never reviewed because I had installed the system for insurance documentation purposes and had never had a reason to pull the files. I had forgotten, in the way that a builder forgets the wiring inside a finished wall, that the system had been recording everything since the day I powered it on. I opened the August files. The timestamp read August 19th, 2023. 7 weeks before Nathan died. The camera angle was the same fixed, wide shot of the living room. The overhead light was on, the warm-tone LED that Nathan and I had compromised on after 20 minutes of good-natured argument because I wanted incandescent and he wanted something efficient, and neither of us was willing to concede entirely. That light was on now in the footage, and beneath it Victor Stahl had a medical file open on the table. I recognized the format. Nathan had brought work home often enough that I knew the general shape of a patient chart, the tabbed sections, the printed headers, the particular weight of the paper. But this chart was not a patient's. The name tab at the top was turned toward the camera just enough for the microphone side lens to resolve 3 letters before the rest disappeared into the fold of Victor's hand. N.A.T. Victor was explaining something to Diane in the register of a man who is accustomed to being the most informed person in any room. His voice carried the specific confidence of clinical expertise, applied outside its clinical context, which is a different sound than a doctor speaking to a patient. It is the sound of a man using his knowledge as architecture. He described a class of medication I will not name here because the specifics belong to a courtroom and not to a story, but I will tell you what it does in plain terms. It is a blood thinner. Nathan had been prescribed it by Victor himself, his cardiologist and colleague of 10 years, for a minor clotting concern identified during a routine physical the previous spring. A legitimate prescription for a legitimate condition managed by a Dr. Nathan trusted without reservation. Victor explained to Diane that the dosage had been modified 3 times over the preceding 6 months. Not the dosage on file at the hospital pharmacy where Nathan worked and where every prescription was logged and tracked, the actual dosage. The pills Victor handed to Nathan each month from his office, which did not match the pills recorded in the system. The modification was incremental, precise, calculated to produce a specific physiological condition under specific circumstances. At altitude, Victor said, with sustained physical exertion, the modified dose creates a coagulation window. The body forms a clot it would not otherwise form, at a location and a time that can be predicted within a reasonable range. Diane leaned forward. She had been quiet until this moment, listening with the attentive stillness of a woman who is not learning new information, but confirming information she already possesses. She was an emergency room nurse. She understood clotting cascades and intervention windows and the precise number of minutes between the onset of a stroke and the point at which intervention becomes impossible. She said, "The section past the Stratton summit. No cell coverage for 4 miles. 90 minutes from the nearest rescue station. I will stay behind at the junction. He will go ahead alone because I will tell him I am tired." Victor said, "No toxicology will flag it because it is his own prescribed medication at a modified dose." Diane said, "He trusts me to know his medication. He trusts you to prescribe it. That is all we need. I want you to understand what it means to watch 2 people plan your son's death on a table your son sanded himself, under a light your son helped you wire, in a room where your son ate breakfast 100 times. I had thought the November footage showed me what I was dealing with. I was wrong. November was the execution. August was the architecture. And architecture, whether it is built from wood or gears or pharmaceutical knowledge, is where every deliberate decision lives. I did not move my hand from the bench. I did not stop the recording. I owed Nathan that much, to witness what had been designed for him without looking away. The footage continued for another 6 minutes. Logistics, timing, the specific trail section, the weather window, the prescription refill schedule that would place the final modified dose in Nathan's hands 3 days before the planned hike. I watched all of it. When the file ended, I sat in the dark of the workshop and let myself be a father for a few minutes. Not a watchmaker with a mechanism to diagnose. Not a man with a thumb drive and a theory. Just a father who had watched his son be taken from him by 2 people who had sat at his table and attended his funeral with practiced expressions of loss. I let that be real for as long as it needed to be. Then I put it away. The way you put away a tool you are not ready to use yet. Carefully. With intention. In a place you can find it when the time comes. I copied the August files to the drive. I checked both copies. I restored the monitor settings. Before I closed the panel, I scrolled down one more time. To July. The footage loaded. Diane was speaking, and the name she said landed in the room the way a gear lands when it drops from a movement you thought was complete. She said it with the ease of someone naming a clock she had already taken apart once before. A mechanism she knew from the inside out. Every wheel. Every spring. Every point of failure. The name was George Harmon. George Harmon was a name I had never heard. Not at the hospital gatherings where Nathan introduced colleagues by first name and specialty. Not at the funeral where 100 people passed through a receiving line and said things I no longer remember. Not in any conversation I had ever had with Diane in the 4 years she had been married to my son. The footage was dated July 11th, 2023. 3 months before Nathan died. The living room again. The same camera angle. The same fixed wide shot that had recorded everything else I had seen that night. Diane was on the couch with her legs folded beneath her. A glass of water on the table. Victor was in the chair by the window. The posture between them was not the posture of people conducting a meeting. It was the posture of people continuing a conversation that had been running for a long time. Diane said the name the way you say the name of a road you have driven before. Without emphasis. Without introduction. As though the person on the other end of the conversation already knew the route and did not need directions. She said, George was straightforward. Heart patient, existing condition, existing medication. Victor adjusted the dosage over 8 months. Cardiac event. At home. The wife filed a complaint afterward, Something about an irregular prescription change. But it was reviewed internally and shelved within 6 weeks. Victor said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The complaint is still in the hospital archive. It was never destroyed, but no one has accessed it since 2018, Diane said. 1.8 million. And no one looked at anything. I sat with those words in the dark of the workshop, and I ran the arithmetic the way I run any calculation that determines whether a mechanism will hold or fail. Slowly, in sequence, without skipping a step. 2017. George Harmon, 58 years old. Heart patient under Victor Stahl's care. Medication adjusted over 8 months. Died of cardiac event at home. Insurance payout. $1.8 million. Victor listed as medical advisor on the policy. Wife filed a complaint about irregular prescription changes. Complaint reviewed internally by the hospital. Shelved. No follow-up. Case closed. 2023. Nathan Bellamy, 36 years old. Prescribed blood thinners by Victor Stahl, his cardiologist and colleague of 10 years. Dosage modified 3 times over 6 months. Died of stroke on the long trail. At elevation under exertion. Insurance policy, $3.5 million. Diane listed as sole beneficiary. Medical examiner ruled natural causes. Case closed in 11 days. 6 years between them. 1.8 million to 3.5 million. The target nearly doubled. The method unchanged. Refined but structurally identical. A patient under Victor's care. A medication adjusted incrementally to produce a fatal event that appeared natural. A death that closed without investigation because the surface of it looked exactly the way a natural death is supposed to look. My son was not the beginning. He was the second application of a system that had already been built and tested and found to work without failure 6 years before he ever sat across a table from the 2 people who would use it on him. I want you to hold that for a moment. Not the legal architecture of it. Not the financial mechanics. What I want you to hold is the image of George Harmon, a man I had never met, who died 6 years before my son in a house I had never visited, whose wife had filed a complaint that said something is wrong and had been told by the institution responsible for listening that nothing was wrong and had been sent home to grieve inside a lie that no one was required to reopen. George Harmon had been dead for 6 years, and the complaint his wife had written sat in an archive in the same hospital where my son went to work every morning. 6 years. And no one asked a question that might have changed what happened on the long trail in October. I had to hold that without letting it become what I was working from. Anger is a poor mainspring. I have seen what it does to a mechanism built around it. The oscillation is erratic, the amplitude unstable. And eventually the spring fractures at the point of greatest stress and the entire movement seizes. I had watched it happen in clocks and I had watched it happen in men, and I was not going to let it happen in me. Not now. Not with what I was carrying. I copied the July files onto a separate section of the thumb drive, clearly labeled, time-stamped, isolated from the Nathan footage so there would be no ambiguity about which evidence pertained to which case. I checked both copies. I restored the panel settings. I stood in the doorway of the workshop for a moment before I locked it. Looking at the bench where the pencil still lay at the angle Nathan had left it. At the monitor screen gone dark. At the graph paper, still pinned above the parts cabinet, with dimensions in my son's hand that I would never see completed. Then I locked the door and walked to the truck in the dark. The mountain air was still. The stars were out, which meant the temperature had dropped further, and the cold found every surface of me that was not covered. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before I started the engine. I was not driving toward my house. I was not going back to Bennington to sit in my workshop and stare at a mainspring I still could not hold steady. I was driving toward a porch light in Stowe, 14 miles north, where a man I had known for 30 years kept his kitchen light on until dawn, and never once in all those years had asked why you showed up early. He simply opened the door and put the coffee on and waited for you to say what you came to say. His name was Frank Tierney. He was 70 years old, a retired state medical investigator who had spent 30 years reading the internal records of hospitals and pharmaceutical operations and finding the places where the numbers did not agree with each other. Nathan had called him Uncle Frank since he was old enough to say the name. I started the engine. The headlights found the gravel and the tree line on both sides, the birches white as bone in the dark, and I drove the 14 miles to Stowe without turning on the radio, which is how I drive when I am building something in my mind. By the time I saw Frank's porch light through the trees at the end of his road, I had the shape of what I needed to say arranged in the order it needed to be said. The shape of it was simple. The weight of it was not. Frank Tierney opened the door before I finished knocking. He looked at my face, then at the thumb drive in my hand, and then he stepped back without saying a word and held the door open the way a man holds a door, when he understands that what is coming through it is heavier than conversation. The kitchen smelled of coffee already brewed. The most ordinary smell in the world, and it sat strangely against everything I was carrying. Frank said, "Sit down, Art. Coffee is on." I sat. I placed the thumb drive on the table between us. Frank poured 2 cups and brought them over and sat across from me. And his hands settled around his cup the way they always settled. Unhurried, precise. The hands of a man who had spent 30 years reading hospital records, the way I read watch movements, looking for the place where the numbers disagree with each other and following that disagreement to its source. He did not ask me anything. He waited. That was Frank. He understood that a man who arrives before dawn with something in his hand will speak when he is ready, and that the space between arrival and speaking is not empty. It is where the words arrange themselves into the order they need to be in. I told him everything. I started with the porch and the sound of the pendulum through the cabin walls. I told him about the firelight and Diane in Nathan's chair, wearing the Elgin pocket watch I had restored for 6 months and given to my son on the day he graduated from pharmacy school. I described Victor crossing the living room with the ease of ownership. I told him about the workshop, the recording system I had installed the previous February for insurance documentation, the amber light that told me the system had been running for 31 days without interruption. I told him about the 7 visits, about Diane's key cut from a clean impression, about the $3.5 million and the contestability window. I told him about the August footage, the medical file on the table, the dosage modifications Victor had described in the clinical language of a man explaining a procedure to a colleague rather than confessing a crime. I told him what Diane had said about the trail section past Stratton Summit, the 4 miles without cell coverage, the 90 minutes to the nearest rescue station, the plan to stay behind at the junction. I told him about George Harmon. The hardest part was saying Nathan's name in this room, in this context, aloud, where someone other than myself could hear it. Not because Frank was a stranger to that name. Nathan had called him Uncle Frank since he could form the words. Because saying Nathan's name, in the context of what those recordings showed, made something true that I had been holding at arm's length since the first file played on that monitor. It made it true the way a regulator pin makes a rate true. No more drift. No more hoping the measurement will change if you take it again. Frank listened to all of it without expression, without interruption. When I reached the July footage, Diane's mention of George Harmon, the $1.8 million, the complaint filed by the wife, and shelved internally without follow-up, Frank's eyes moved once to the thumb drive on the table, and then back to me. That was the only movement he made during the entire account. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet in the specific way. A kitchen is quiet at 6:45 on a November morning. A silence that holds the weight of what has just been said, and does not attempt to reduce it. Frank looked at his coffee cup for what I counted as roughly 10 seconds. Then he spoke for approximately 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes he laid out the architecture of my situation with the same precision he had applied to every investigation he had conducted in 30 years of state service. He told me that what I had on the drive established conspiracy with strong supporting evidence, premeditated access to secured property, a documented timeline of repeated occupation, and an explicit on-camera discussion of financial motive tied to a specific policy window. He said that in a civil proceeding I was holding something substantial. In a criminal proceeding, For the charge that fit what I knew had happened on that trail, the footage built motive and method and planning. It did not place either of them on the mountain at the moment of Nathan's death. It established the architecture. It did not confirm the event. He said, "What you have will end their careers and convict them of fraud. But for what you know they did to your son, you need what is in his blood." He explained it without ceremony. When a death is classified as natural causes at a hospital, standard protocol requires the retention of biological samples for a minimum period. Nathan's blood had been drawn and stored as part of the post-mortem intake process, not as evidence. As procedure, a formality built into the system so that if questions arose later, the record was clean. The samples had been sitting in hospital storage since the afternoon of October 7th, refrigerated, undisturbed. No one had tested them for dosage irregularity because there had been no reason to. The case was closed as a natural cardiac event within 11 days. And once a case closes, the samples sit until someone files a formal request. 5 weeks of clean cold storage. No degradation. No tampering. No one had looked at them since the day they were received. Then Frank told me something that changed the floor beneath me for the second time that night. He said he was already aware of the George Harmon complaint. He said the file had come across his desk in 2018, 6 months after Harmon's death, as part of a routine review of hospital incident reports that his office processed quarterly during his final years in the State Bureau. He had flagged it internally. His flag had been noted, acknowledged, and filed without action, because the review board determined there was insufficient evidence to warrant a formal investigation. The complaint remained in the archive, shelved but not destroyed. Frank had filed a formal inquiry with the state medical board that morning. Before I called him from the truck, before I said what I said about George Harmon, he had submitted the request based on what he had independently identified during his years in the Bureau and had been carrying quietly since his retirement. I asked him how long he had been aware of it. He said, "Long enough to know the file was worth preserving." That was all he said about his timeline, and I did not push further. Frank set his cup down. He looked at me directly with the steady, unadorned attention of a man who has delivered difficult assessments for 3 decades and has learned that the most respectful thing you can do with a hard truth is hand it over clean. He said, "Did Nathan keep records of his own prescriptions?" I stopped. The question landed in a place I had not examined. Nathan was a clinical pharmacist. Pharmacists do not simply take what they are given. They verify. They cross-reference. They maintain personal records of every compound they put into their own bodies, because that is the discipline of the profession. And because Nathan, in particular, had never in his life accepted a number without checking it against the source. He would have kept copies. I was certain of it the way I am certain of the tolerance in a hairspring I have adjusted myself. The question was not whether he kept them. The question was where. I drove back to Bennington in the thin light of a November morning that had not yet decided whether to arrive. The road was empty in both directions. The thumb drive was in my breast pocket, buttoned against my chest, and the weight of it was real in the way that the weight of a pocket watch is real. Small enough to hold in one hand, heavy enough to change the balance of everything around it. Frank had told me 2 things at the door before I left. The first was that the State Medical Board inquiry on the George Harmon file was now formally active and assigned to a review examiner. The second was a single instruction delivered in the same tone he used for everything that mattered. "When you have what you need, you call me first. Not the police. Not a lawyer. Me." I asked him why the sequence mattered. He said, "Because what happens next depends on how the first call is made, and I need to be the one who makes it." I did not push further. With Frank, the instruction and the reason arrived together when both were needed, and separately when only one was. I sat at my kitchen table in Bennington with the morning light coming through the east window and a cup of coffee I did not drink. And I thought about what I had and what I still needed and the distance between the two. I thought about it the way I think about a clock that has been brought to me in pieces. Not as a problem to solve immediately, but as a sequence to understand before the first tool touches the first component. What I had was footage. Motive, method, planning, financial architecture, and a historical precedent that connected the current case to a previous death by the same mechanism. What I did not yet have was the physical confirmation. The blood work that would transform the footage from accusation into evidence, and the prescription records that would prove the dosage on paper did not match the dosage in practice. The blood samples were in hospital storage, accessible only through formal channels that Frank was now navigating. That process would take time, and the time was not mine to accelerate. The prescription records, if Nathan had kept personal copies, were somewhere I had not yet looked. That search would come, but it would come at the right moment, not before. What I could do, in the days between now and the completion of Frank's process, was something I had learned from 45 years of working with mechanisms that operate on tension and release. I could introduce a disturbance into the system. Not a large one, not an obvious one. The kind of disturbance that a skilled hand introduces into a watch movement when testing for a hidden fault, a slight increase in pressure at a specific point, just enough to reveal whether the mechanism is sound or whether there is a weakness that will eventually cause it to fail on its own. Anger is a poor mainspring. I had told myself that in the workshop, and I meant it. But precision is not anger. Precision is the controlled application of exactly the right force, at exactly the right point, at exactly the right time. That is what a watchmaker does. That is all a watchmaker does. I went to my workshop at the back of the house and opened the cabinet where I keep the personal collection, the watches I have acquired over 45 years that are not for sale and not for repair, but simply for the pleasure of holding a well-made thing and understanding how it works. There were 37 pieces in the cabinet. I selected 5. The first was an Elgin from 1920, a railroad-grade pocket watch with a white porcelain dial and blued hands, accurate to within a second per day when I had last regulated it. I set its hands to 2:47 in the afternoon. That was the time recorded on Nathan's hospital intake form as the estimated time of death. The second was a Waltham from 1915, with a coin silver case I had polished myself until the metal held the light like water. I set its hands to 11:15 in the morning. That was the time George Harmon's death certificate listed as the approximate hour of cardiac arrest. The third was a Hamilton from 1942, a military issue piece with a black dial and luminous numerals that still glowed faintly in the dark after 80 years. I set its hands to 9:30 in the morning. That was the time Victor Stahl had signed the first modified prescription for Nathan's blood thinner, the timestamp visible on the August footage when he laid the medical file open on Nathan's table. The fourth was a small Swiss piece, an Omega from 1958, with a case so thin it disappeared in your palm. I set its hands to 8 o'clock in the morning. That was the time Diane had called the insurance company to initiate the claim, a detail she had mentioned casually on the November footage while Victor poured her a glass of wine in my son's kitchen. The fifth was a Longines from 1933, the oldest piece in the selection, with a movement so finely finished that the Geneva stripes on the bridges caught the light like the surface of a river. I set its hands to 3:15 in the afternoon. That was the time Victor had filed the fraudulent prescription at an out-of-county clinic, a timestamp I had captured from the August footage and written in my notebook beside the words Nathan had inscribed on the first page. 5 clocks. 5 times. Each one frozen at a moment that meant nothing to the person who would receive them and everything to the person who sent them. I wrapped each watch separately in plain brown paper. No return address, no note, no explanation. Just a pocket watch stopped at a specific hour, arriving in Victor Stahl's mailbox from a sender who did not exist, carrying a message that only a guilty man's imagination could decode. Then I drove to Bennington and bought a prepaid phone at the gas station on Route 9, paying cash. I drove north to Manchester and bought a second at the hardware store on Main Street. I drove east to Arlington and bought a third at the general store near the covered bridge. 3 phones, 3 towns, 3 transactions in cash, each accompanied by a bottle of water, so the purchase read as a road stop and not a procurement. Back at my kitchen table, I drafted the first message by hand before I typed it. The drafting took 30 minutes, not because the message was long, but because every word needed to carry exactly the right weight. No more, no less. The way every gear in a well-made watch carries exactly the load it was cut to carry, and not a fraction beyond it. The message was for Diane. 9 words. The dosage changed 3 times in 6 months. Someone noticed. I mailed the first watch on a Monday morning from the post office in Pownell, a small brick building 6 miles south of Bennington where the clerk knows me by sight but not by conversation. The Elgin, the one frozen at 247, went into a padded envelope with Victor Stahl's home address, printed in block capitals that did not resemble my handwriting because I had written them with my left hand. No return address. No note inside. Just the weight of a pocket watch that had been keeping time for over 100 years, now stopped at the hour my son's heart stopped beating. 3 days later, the Waltham went out from the post office in Wilmington. 3 days after that, the Hamilton from Brattleboro. I rotated the locations the way I rotate the oils I use on different movements. Never the same source twice in sequence. Never a pattern that could be traced by anyone looking for one. The 4th and 5th watches followed at the same interval from Newfane and Jacksonville, 2 villages small enough that the postmark would mean nothing to a man in Stowe trying to determine where the packages originated. I did not need to explain the clocks to Victor. That is the point I want you to understand about this particular kind of pressure. A guilty person's imagination is the most powerful instrument available to anyone working from the outside. I did not need to tell him what I knew. I did not need to tell him what the times meant or why a stranger was mailing him antique pocket watches frozen at hours that corresponded to the worst decisions of his life. His own mind would do that work. His own guilt would construct the interpretation, would run the arithmetic, would lie awake calculating the perimeter of what someone out there might know. I only needed to give him the raw material. His conscience, or whatever occupied the space where his conscience should have been, would build the rest. On the same Monday, I mailed the first watch. I typed the message for Diane into the first prepaid phone. 9 words. I read them once on the screen, confirmed they matched the handwritten draft exactly, and pressed send. Then I removed the battery before the screen had finished confirming delivery. The phone went into the glove compartment. I would not use it again. The second message went out 4 days later from the second phone. This one was for Diane as well. Different number, different angle. The trail report has gaps in it. The weather that morning does not match. I pulled that battery too. Then I waited. I sat in the armchair by the front window of my house in Bennington, the chair where I have sat 10,000 evenings reading or thinking or simply watching the light change on the street, and I let the silence do its work. Every minute that passed without a response was a minute in which 2 people somewhere in Vermont were deciding how to react, what to say to each other, whether to call each other first or wait. I did not need to do anything during those minutes. The mechanism was running. I only needed to let it tick. I thought about Nathan at 9 years old, falling asleep in the truck on the drive home from a hike. His head at the angle only children can sustain, completely surrendered to sleep. I thought about his hands at 16, holding a pocket watch I had given him to practice on, turning it over with the slow attention of someone who understood that the thing in his hands was both fragile and important, and that the 2 qualities were related. The house had never been this quiet since October. I used the quiet the way I had been using everything else available to me. As material. Diane called my regular phone on a Tuesday evening, 6 days after the first message. Her voice was warm and measured, carrying just enough weight of concern to be convincing to someone who was not listening for the machinery beneath it. She said she had been thinking about Nathan's things, that she had been going through some drawers and had found a few items she thought I might want. She asked whether I would like to come by that week to pick them up. I said I would appreciate that very much. She said Thursday would work. I said Thursday was fine. I arrived at her apartment at 10 in the morning with the expression of a man who has not slept well in 5 weeks, which was not a performance because I had not slept well in 5 weeks, and with the posture of a man who is grateful for any connection to his dead son, which was also not a performance. The parts of me that were acting and the parts that were genuine occupied the same body without contradiction, the way a clock can run 2 time zones on a single movement if the mechanism is designed for it. She had Nathan's things arranged on the kitchen table. 3 notebooks in his precise pharmacist's hand. A field guide to Vermont wildflowers he had kept since college. A small wooden box I had made for him when he was 12 to hold his first set of watchmaking loops. Diane touched the cover of the top notebook once with 2 fingers. Carefully. Reverently. At a moment that was exactly right for such a gesture. I watched her do it, and understood that she had prepared for this visit the way I had prepared for the phone call, and had arrived at the same conclusion that the authentic emotion available to her was the most convincing material she had. We talked about Nathan. The particular details that do not belong in a eulogy, but that hold the shape of a person more accurately than anything spoken at a lectern. I drank the coffee she offered. I held the wooden box in my hands and looked at it for a while because looking at it was real, and the looking did not require performance. Then, midway through a sentence about the funeral, I let Victor's name enter the conversation. The way you let a grain of dust settle onto a watch dial. Not placed, not thrown, simply allowed to land. I said. Victor said something similar at the service. Have you heard from him since? Diane said. After a pause that lasted approximately 1 full second. Once or twice. You know how it is. People drift after. It lasted less than a second. The expression that crossed her face. But I had been waiting 3 weeks for exactly that calculation, and I did not miss it. It was not fear. It was not guilt. It was the expression of a person performing arithmetic, rapid, internal, invisible to anyone who was not looking for precisely that operation. She was measuring whether my mention of Victor was accidental, the natural drift of a grieving father's conversation, or something else. She was measuring me. And I recognized the process because I had been running the same measurement on her since I sat down. I finished my coffee. I picked up the notebooks and the wooden box. I thanked her for keeping them safe. I said Nathan had always kept everything in notebooks, always had. Even as a boy. She said he was so careful about things like that. Her voice was steady and gave me nothing further. I carried the notebooks to my truck under one arm. I had thought the performance would feel like acting. It felt instead like a clock running 2 separate time zones on the same movement. Both hands moving, both accurate, both pointing to a different hour. The 3rd watch arrived in Victor Stahl's mailbox on a Tuesday. The Hamilton, the military issue piece with the black dial and the luminous numerals still faintly glowing after 80 years of darkness, frozen at 9:30 in the morning. The exact hour he had signed the first modified prescription. I know this because I had calculated the postal transit time from Brattleboro and confirmed the delivery window with the tracking number I had requested at the counter, a detail that cost me nothing, except the appearance of an ordinary customer who wanted to ensure a package arrived safely. I was sitting in my armchair by the front window when my regular phone lit up. The screen showed Diane's name. The timestamp was 7:23 in the evening, which meant she had waited approximately 4 hours after the mail would have been delivered to Victor's address before calling me. 4 hours. That is not the response time of a woman who happens to be thinking about her father-in-law. That is the response time of a woman who received a phone call from someone who had just opened a package and who spent 4 hours deciding what to do about it before picking up her own phone. Her voice carried the specific warmth I had come to recognize as her operating register, the tone calibrated to sound like independent concern rather than coordinated response. She said she had been going through another drawer and had found Nathan's silver pocket watch, the Elgin I had restored. And she wanted to know if I would like it back. I want you to hold that for a moment. She offered to return the watch she was wearing around her neck the night I saw her through the cabin window. The watch she had been wearing in a dead man's chair, by a dead man's fire, with the ease of someone who considered it hers. She was offering it back now, not because she had found it in a drawer, but because it was the thinnest pretext available to her on short notice. And a controlled person uses a thin pretext only when they are moving quickly and do not have time to construct a better one. I said, "Yes, of course. I would appreciate that very much, Diane." She said a few things about how she had been thinking about Nathan's colleagues, about how some people seem to carry grief differently than others. Then she turned the conversation toward Victor, with the precision of a hand moving across a dial. She said he had been acting strangely. She said he seemed unreachable. She used the word struggling, not as a diagnosis, but as a marker, a word being placed in the air between us, so that it would exist there if it was ever needed again. She said, "I worry about him. He has always carried things alone. I do not think any of us really knew how to reach him." I said, "No, I suppose we did not." I recognized what she was doing the way I recognize a faulty escapement by the irregularity of its beat. On any job site, when a mechanism begins to fail, the components nearest the point of failure start moving away from it before the failure is visible to anyone looking from outside. They do not announce their movement. They simply begin to establish, quietly and in advance, a position from which they were never standing near the problem. Diane was moving. She was doing it in the language of care and concern for a troubled colleague. But the direction was unmistakable. She was creating distance between herself and Victor Stahl, and she was doing it in front of a witness she believed was too grief-stricken to notice. I let her finish. I said what she expected me to say. I thanked her for checking in. We ended the call warmly. I set the phone on the kitchen table and sat for a moment with my hands flat on the wood, the way I place my hands flat on a workbench before beginning a repair that requires absolute steadiness. If you are still here with me, please drop a quick comment to let me know you are still on this journey. Type the number 104 below if you can feel the weight of what art is carrying. And a small reminder, the following segment includes some reimagined elements for the narrative. If you prefer not to continue, you may step away from the video now. That evening, I picked up the third phone, the last one. I wrote the message by hand first, the way I had written all the others, but this one was different. It was not a fragment. It was not an implication. It was 4 sentences, and when I read them back, I did not change a word. The message was for Victor. It read, "I know about George Harmon. I know what happened in 2017. I know the method has not changed. Someone kept the complaint file. I typed it. I sent it. I pulled the battery for the last time." The phone went into the glove compartment beside the other 2 dead phones, 3 silent instruments that had served their purpose and would not be needed again. I drove home in the full dark of a November night, with the windows down because the cold air felt like the only honest thing available to me at that hour. I had built what I could build. The 5 watches were delivered. The messages were sent. The State Medical Board inquiry was active. Frank was in position. The mechanism I had assembled over the preceding weeks was now running on its own tension, and there was nothing left for my hands to do except wait for it to reach the hour it was set to strike. There is a kind of waiting that is work, and there is a kind of waiting that is trust. I had spent weeks in the first kind, moving through a sequence of steps I had designed myself, one gear at a time. What came now was the second kind, and I had not known until I was inside it how much harder it is to trust a mechanism you have built than to keep adjusting it with your own hands. A watchmaker learns to trust the movement eventually, or he never stops regulating, and the regulation becomes its own kind of evasion. I made coffee in the mornings. I walked the property in the afternoons. I ate at a reasonable hour. I did not reach for a phone. On the second evening, I picked up the mainspring I had not been able to seat since October, the one from the bracket clock that had been sitting on my bench for 5 weeks with its case open and its movement exposed, waiting for hands steady enough to finish the repair. I picked up the tweezers. I held the spring between my fingertips. My hands were not shaking. I did not notice that until the spring was already seated. It slid into the barrel, the way a well-cut gear slides onto its arbor, with resistance that resolves into alignment at the precise moment the component reaches its correct position. I looked at my hands for a moment. They were steady. I did not know what that meant yet. I set the clock aside and went to bed. 4 days of silence. No call from Victor. No call from Diane. On the morning of the 5th day, Frank called before 7. His voice had a register I had not heard from him in 30 years of friendship. Not urgency. Not alarm. A particular quality of weight. The voice of a man who has been holding something carefully since it arrived and is now ready to set it down. The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. I know the time because I was already awake. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had not yet touched, watching the steam curl upward in the gray light, the way smoke rises from a candle after you blow it out. Slow, weightless, going nowhere in particular. I had been awake since 4, which was not unusual. Sleep had become a negotiation I lost most nights, and the nights I won, I woke with the feeling that I had merely closed my eyes and opened them again without any rest in between. Frank Tierney's name appeared on the screen. I picked up on the second ring. He did not say good morning. He did not ask if I had slept. He said, "Victor Stahl walked into the Bennington Police Department last night at 11:15. He asked to speak with a detective. He has been talking for 7 hours. I set my coffee down. The mug made a small sound against the table, the kind of sound you only hear in a very quiet room. I said nothing. Frank continued. He came alone. No attorney. He asked for a glass of water, sat down, and started from the beginning. He told them about the prescription changes. He told them about the dosage modifications over 6 months. He told them about the August meeting at the cabin. He told them about Diane. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the table. The wood was smooth from years of use. Nathan had sanded this table himself, the summer he turned 30, using progressively finer grits the way I had taught him to finish a watch case. Start coarse. End invisible. I could feel the precision of his work beneath my thumb, and for a moment, I could not speak. "Art," Frank said. "Are you there?" "I am here." He mentioned George Harmon. I closed my eyes. The name I had sent to Victor on that final message. The name Diane had spoken in the July footage. Casually. The way you mention a city you once visited, but never planned to return to. George Harmon. Dead at 51 from a cardiac event in his own driveway in Rutland. 2017. Victor's patient. Victor's adjusted prescription. Diane's first husband's former business partner. The first clock she had stopped. He gave them everything? I asked. Not everything, but enough. He described the method. He described the timeline. He described the financial arrangement with Diane. 3.5 million. Split 60-40. Diane gets 60. Victor gets 40. He said the split was Diane's idea. He said most of it was Diane's idea. I thought about the footage from August 19th. Victor at the table, pointing at the medical chart, explaining the coagulation window with the calm authority of a man who had rehearsed. He had not looked like a man following instructions. He had looked like a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had chosen to do it. But people reveal different versions of themselves, depending on who is watching. A watch can appear to run perfectly from the front while the balance wheel wobbles behind the dial. You only see the truth when you open the case. What happens now? I asked. The county prosecutor's office has the case. They contacted the state police this morning. There will be a formal investigation. They will want the footage. Art. All of it. I have 2 copies. Good. Keep one. Give them one. Do not give them both. Frank paused. I could hear him breathing. After 30 years of friendship, I had learned to read Frank's pauses, the way I read the silence between ticks in a mechanical movement. The pause before he speaks is diagnostic. A short pause means information. A long pause means something harder. This pause was long. There is something else, he said. Victor told them about Nathan's blood work. The hospital stored samples from the initial emergency response. Standard protocol for cardiac events in patients under 40. Those samples are still in the state laboratory in Burlington. The prosecutor has already requested a full independent toxicology panel. I opened my eyes. The coffee steam had disappeared. The mug was cold. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The same window looking out at the same row of birch trees Nathan and I had planted when he was 12. But the light felt different now. Not warmer. Not brighter. Just different. The way light changes when you remove a curtain you had forgotten was there. If the samples confirm the dosage discrepancy, Frank continued, they have physical evidence linking Victor's prescription modifications to Nathan's cardiac event. Combined with the footage, the financial records, and Victor's own statement, the prosecutor can build a case for premeditated homicide. And Diane? Victor's statement implicates her directly. But a co-conspirator's testimony alone is not enough for conviction. They need corroboration. The footage corroborates. The financial trail corroborates. And if Nathan kept records of his own, anything in his own handwriting or his own voice, that becomes the final piece. I thought about Nathan's leather notebook, the one I had found in the workshop drawer, beneath the drafting notes and the calibration logs. I had not opened it past the first few pages. I had not been ready. A father's grief has its own timeline. And mine had kept me from reading my son's private words, the way a locked case keeps you from the movement inside. You need the right key. And you need to be ready to see what the key reveals. Frank, I said. Nathan kept a notebook in the workshop. I saw it the night I found the recordings. I have not read it. Read it today, Art. Read every page. If he wrote anything about his medication, his appointments with Victor, his concerns, anything at all, that notebook becomes evidence in his own voice. A dead man's testimony. After we hung up, I sat with the cold coffee for 11 minutes. I counted them on the kitchen clock, the simple quartz clock above the stove that Nathan always said was beneath our family's dignity. A Bellamy kitchen deserves a mechanical movement, he used to say. And I would tell him that even a watchmaker needs one clock he does not have to wind. He would laugh. I can still hear that laugh if the house is quiet enough, and I am not trying too hard to hear it. I stood up. I rinsed the mug. I put on my coat. I walked to the truck. The notebook was 40 minutes away, in a workshop behind a cabin on a mountain where my son's killers had sat and laughed and planned and believed that no one was listening. But someone had been listening. The walls had been listening, and now, for the first time since Nathan died, I believed the silence was about to end. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine caught on the first try. I pulled out of the driveway and drove north toward Harrow Peak, toward the workshop, toward whatever my son had left behind for me to find. The drive took 43 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. The only sound inside the truck was the engine and my own breathing. And somewhere around mile 6, I realized I was breathing in time with the wipers, even though it was not raining and the wipers were off. The body remembers rhythms the mind has forgotten. A watchmaker knows this. You spend 40 years listening to the tick of a balance wheel, and eventually your own pulse synchronizes. It becomes part of the mechanism whether you want it to or not. The mountain road was empty. November had stripped the maples bare, and the birches stood like white bones against a pewter sky. I passed the turnoff where Nathan and I used to stop for coffee on summer mornings, a flat spot beside a granite boulder where he would sit with his thermos and talk about whatever was on his mind. I did not stop. I drove past it and felt the absence the way you feel a missing tooth. The space is small, but your tongue finds it every time. The cabin appeared through the trees at 8:32. No smoke, no car. The front door was closed. I parked beside the woodpile Nathan had stacked in September. The last physical work his hands had done on this property. The logs were tight, bark side up, alternating direction every third row for airflow. Even in firewood, he had been precise. I walked past the cabin without looking through the window. The recordings existed. Victor was talking. The mechanism was turning on its own now, and my role had shifted from the hand that wins to the hand that waits. But there was one thing left, the thing Frank had told me to do. The thing I had been avoiding since the night I first entered the workshop and saw my son's handwriting on the wall. The workshop door opened on the first turn. The air inside was cold and still. The monitoring hub was dark. Everything I needed from that system was already on the 2 thumb drives in my coat pocket. What I needed now was something older. The leather notebook was in the second drawer of the workbench, beneath calibration sheets and a folded map of the long trail. I picked it up and held it. The leather was soft, darkened with use, and Nathan's initials were pressed into the lower right corner. N.A.B. Nathan Arthur Bellamy. He had carried my name inside his name, the way a pocket watch carries the jeweler's mark inside the case back. Hidden, but permanent. I opened the first page. His handwriting was neat and small. The handwriting of a pharmacist, trained to write clearly on labels, where a misread letter can mean the difference between healing and harm. The first entry was dated March 14th, 2023. Refill today. Warfarin 5 milligrams. Same as last quarter. Victor says, levels are stable. Feel fine. April, May, June. Each entry followed the same pattern. Date, medication, dosage, Victor's assessment, how Nathan felt. The entries were clinical and brief, written with the detachment of a man who trusted the process. But in July, something changed. July 9th. Victor adjusted dosage to 7 milligrams. Says my INR was slightly low at last draw. Did not feel symptomatic. Asked for the lab report. He said he would send it. Has not sent it. July 23rd. Still no lab report. Called the office twice. Victor says he will bring a copy to the cabin next month. Strange that he wants to discuss it in person rather than send electronically. August 2nd. Checked my own INR at the pharmacy. Measured 4.1. That is high for my target range. If Victor raised the dose based on a low reading, the readings do not match. Either the lab made an error, or the number Victor used was not the number the lab produced. I do not want to accuse anyone, but I am a pharmacist. Numbers are what I do, and these numbers do not agree. I stopped reading. I set the notebook on the workbench and placed both hands flat on the wood, the way I used to steady a watch case before making a delicate adjustment. My son had seen it. 7 weeks before he died, Nathan had seen the discrepancy. He had not accused. He had not panicked. He measured. He recorded. He waited for more data. August 15th. 4 days before the footage showed Victor and Diane planning the trail route in this very cabin. Second, INR today. 4.3. Dosage remains at 7 milligrams per Victor's instruction. My calculation suggests 5 milligrams would be appropriate for my weight and history. The 2 milligram difference, sustained over weeks, increases clotting risk significantly at altitude. I have not told Diane. I have not told Dad. I will request my full medical file from the hospital next week and compare every entry against my own records. If something is wrong, the file will show it. He never got that file. He died on the trail 19 days later, 4 miles past the Stratton summit, exactly where Diane had told Victor to send him. I closed the notebook. I held it against my chest. The leather was warm from my grip, and I could feel my heartbeat against the cover, steady and mechanical. My son had left his testimony inside these pages, entry by entry, measurement by measurement, the way a watchmaker logs every adjustment in a repair journal. He had not known he was building a case. He had thought he was keeping records, but the records had become his voice, speaking from a place no one could reach. I placed the notebook in my coat pocket beside the thumb drives. Leather against plastic. his words against their images. The analog and the digital, side by side, pointing toward the same truth. I locked the workshop. I walked to the truck. I called Frank before starting the engine. I read it, I said. And? He knew Frank. 7 weeks before he died, Nathan knew the numbers were wrong. He wrote it all down. Frank was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Bring it to me. Do not stop anywhere. Do not make copies. Bring the original. A dead man's handwriting is worth more than a living man's confession." I started the engine. The notebook was against my chest, and for the first time since I had buried him, I felt something that was not grief or anger. It was certainty, the kind a watchmaker feels when the last gear slides into place and the movement begins to run. Not because you forced it, but because every component is finally where it was always meant to be. The trial began on a Monday in February, 9 weeks after Victor Stahl walked into the Bennington Police Department and started talking. I wore the same suit I had worn to Nathan's funeral, dark gray, single-breasted, the kind of suit a man buys once and hopes to wear as few times as possible. I had pressed it myself that morning, running the iron slowly along each seam the way I used to press the bezel of a watch case into its seat. Precise, final, no room for wrinkles. The Windham County Courthouse was built in 1876, and the courtroom on the second floor still had its original pendulum clock mounted above the judge's bench. I noticed it the moment I walked in. Walnut case, Roman numerals. A Seth Thomas movement from the 1880s, if I had to guess. It was running 3 minutes fast. I knew this because I checked my own watch. The 1942 Hamilton I had carried every day since Nathan died. The same Hamilton I had set to 9:30 in the morning and mailed to Victor's door as the third of 5 messages. The courtroom clock's error did not bother me. Clocks drift. That is their nature. What matters is whether someone corrects them before the drift becomes a lie. The prosecution was led by a woman named Catherine Alcott, 44, with short dark hair and a voice that carried without effort. She had been a federal prosecutor in Boston for 12 years before moving to Vermont, and Frank had told me she was the best in the state for cases built on documentary evidence. She did not smile when she introduced herself. She shook my hand once, firmly, and said, "Mr. Bellamy, your job today is to sit still and let the evidence speak." I told her that was fine. I had spent my career letting mechanisms speak for themselves. You build it right, you set it in motion, and then you step back. The first 3 days were procedural. Jury selection, opening statements, the architecture of legal process that most people find tedious, but that I found strangely comforting. Structure has always calmed me. A trial is a mechanism with moving parts, each one dependent on the one before it. Each one timed to engage at the precise moment it is needed. I understood this the way I understood a gear train. You do not rush a gear train. You let each wheel turn at its own rate, and the output is accuracy. Catherine's opening statement lasted 22 minutes. She began with a single sentence that silenced the room. Nathan Bellamy was murdered by the 2 people he trusted most in the world, and he spent the last 7 weeks of his life writing down the proof. She placed the leather notebook on the evidence table as she said it. I watched the jury look at it. 12 faces, 12 different expressions, but every pair of eyes went to that small brown book with the initials pressed into the corner. N. A. B. My son's name in his own leather, holding his own words, sitting under fluorescent lights in a room where strangers would decide what those words were worth. On the 4th day, Clara Webb took the stand. Clara was 38. A music teacher at the elementary school in Manchester, and she had been Nathan's closest friend outside of family. They had met at a community orchestra rehearsal 7 years earlier, Nathan on cello, Clara on violin. She had visited the cabin twice in the months before Nathan died, and on her second visit, in late July, Nathan had told her something he had not told anyone else. He said his medication felt wrong, Clara said. Her voice was steady but thin, the kind of voice that holds itself together through effort rather than ease. He said the numbers did not make sense. He said he had checked them himself at the pharmacy, and they did not match what Victor had told him. Catherine asked, "Did he say he suspected foul play?" "No. He said he suspected an error. He said he was going to get his full medical file and compare it himself. He said he was a pharmacist, and this was what pharmacists do." "Did he mention Diane?" Clara paused. She looked down at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes moved briefly to where I was sitting, and I saw something in them that I recognized. It was the look of a person who has carried a piece of information for months without knowing its weight until this moment. He said Diane had been spending more time at Victor's office than usual. He said she told him it was for her own annual checkup, but the visits were weekly. He said he did not want to think what he was thinking. The courtroom was quiet. The Seth Thomas clock above the judge ticked steadily, 3 minutes ahead of the truth, and no one noticed except me. On the 5th day, Catherine presented the footage. A screen was set up facing the jury, and the August 19th recording played in full. 17 minutes and 43 seconds of Victor and Diane sitting at the cabin table, pointing at a medical chart, discussing the coagulation window, the trail route, the timing. Victor's voice was clinical. Diane's voice was calm. They spoke about my son's death the way two engineers might discuss a structural load. How much pressure? Where to apply it? When to let gravity finish the work? I watched the jury watch the footage. A woman in the front row pressed her hand against her mouth. A man in the back row closed his eyes for 3 seconds and then opened them again, as if he had hoped the image would change. It did not change. The footage was what it was. 31 days of evidence recorded by 4 cameras and 2 microphones in a workshop built by a father and son over 3 summers, capturing the voices of the people who had planned to end one of those lives. Catherine then placed Nathan's notebook beside the screen and read aloud the August 2nd entry. "I do not want to accuse anyone, but I am a pharmacist. Numbers are what I do, and these numbers do not agree." She let the words sit in the air for 6 full seconds before turning to the jury and saying, "Nathan Bellamy did not live long enough to make his accusation, so we are here to make it for him." I looked at the clock above the judge. Still 3 minutes fast. Still uncorrected. But in this room, on this day, the time did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be close enough to tell the truth. On the 6th day of the trial, Catherine Alcott said a name that was not on the original indictment. She said it quietly. "The way you say a word you have been holding in reserve, waiting for the exact moment when it will carry the most weight." She said, "George Harmon." The defense attorney, a tall man named Philip Crane, who wore his reading glasses on a silver chain around his neck, objected immediately. He called it prejudicial. He called it irrelevant. He called it an attempt to introduce a separate and unrelated matter into a case that should be decided on its own evidence. Judge Alderman, a 71-year-old man with white hair and steady hands, overruled the objection in 4 words. "I will allow it." Catherine turned to the jury. She held a single sheet of paper. A complaint filed with the Vermont State Medical Board in 2017, case number 2017-441. The complaint concerned a patient named George Harmon, age 51, who had died of a sudden cardiac event in his driveway in Rutland on the morning of October 3, 2017. The attending cardiologist was Victor Stahl. The prescribed medication was warfarin. The dosage had been adjusted 3 times in the 6 months preceding the death. I watched the jury. The woman in the front row who had pressed her hand to her mouth the day before was now sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Catherine the way you watch someone who is about to tell you something you already suspect, but have not yet been willing to believe. The man in the back row was leaning forward. He had not leaned forward once in 5 days. George Harmon, Catherine said, was Victor Stahl's patient for 4 years. During the last 6 months of his life, his warfarin dosage was modified 3 times. Each modification increased the dose beyond the recommended range for his weight and medical history. The final dosage, sustained for 11 weeks, created a coagulation imbalance that made a cardiac event statistically probable under conditions of physical exertion or altitude exposure. She paused. She set the complaint on the evidence table beside Nathan's notebook. 2 documents, 7 years apart, describing the same method applied to 2 different men by the same physician. George Harmon enjoyed distance cycling, Catherine continued. On the morning of his death, he completed a 42-mile ride through the hills east of Rutland. He collapsed in his driveway 17 minutes after returning home. The medical examiner ruled the death as natural cardiac failure. The complaint filed by Harmon's sister was reviewed by the medical board and closed without action. The dosage records were never independently verified. Philip Crane objected again. Judge Alderman overruled again. The courtroom was silent except for the Seth Thomas clock, still running 3 minutes fast, ticking above us all like a heartbeat that belongs to no one. Catherine then called her final witness for the day, a woman named Dr. Rachel Sung, a forensic pharmacologist from the University of Vermont Medical Center. Dr. Sung was 46, spoke in precise sentences, and had spent 14 years studying medication-related fatalities. She had reviewed both cases at the prosecution's request, Nathan Bellamy and George Harmon, and her analysis was contained in a 47-page report that had been entered into evidence the previous afternoon. Dr. Sung, Catherine said, in your professional opinion, are the dosage modification patterns in these 2 cases consistent with medical error? No, Dr. Sung said. Medical errors in warfarin dosing are typically singular events. A physician misreads a lab value, prescribes an incorrect dose, and the error is caught at the next follow-up. What we see in both cases is a systematic pattern of incremental increases over a sustained period, each increase small enough to appear clinically justifiable in isolation, but cumulatively producing a dosage far outside the therapeutic range for patients of similar weight and history. Could these patterns occur independently by coincidence? The statistical probability of 2 patients under the same physician experiencing the same pattern of 3 incremental dosage increases over the same 6-month time frame, both resulting in fatal cardiac events during physical exertion, is extraordinarily low. In my professional assessment, these patterns are consistent with intentional manipulation of prescribed medication. The word intentional landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. I could see the ripples move across the jury box. 2 jurors wrote something on their notepads. One juror looked directly at me for the first time since the trial began, and in that look I saw recognition. Not sympathy, not pity. Recognition. The understanding that what happened to my son was not an accident, not a tragedy of circumstance, but a design. A mechanism built by 2 people who understood how the human body works and used that knowledge to stop it. Catherine was not finished. She placed one final document on the evidence table. It was a life insurance policy, issued in April of 2017, 6 months before George Harmon's death. The policy was for $1.8 million. The primary beneficiary was Harmon's wife, Sandra, who had divorced him 3 years earlier but remained on the policy due to an administrative oversight that had never been corrected. Sandra Harmon had remarried in 2016. Her new husband's name was not relevant to the case. What was relevant was the woman who had introduced Sandra to Victor Stahl at a fundraising event in Burlington in 2015. That woman was Diane Bellamy. I heard the sound before I understood it. A small, involuntary exhale from somewhere in the jury box. The kind of breath that escapes when a person suddenly sees the full shape of something they had only been seeing in pieces. I knew that feeling. I had felt it myself in the workshop, scrolling through July footage, hearing Diane say George Harmon's name as though it were nothing more than a footnote. But footnotes are where the truth hides. Any watchmaker will tell you that the smallest gear in a movement is often the one that controls the complication. Remove it, and the calendar stops. The moon phase freezes. the entire system fails. Diane had not failed. She had built a system that worked twice. Different men, different cities, different insurance amounts, but the same architecture, the same physician, the same drug, the same slow escalation designed to look like natural variation until the body reached its limit and stopped. Catherine rested her case at 4:17 in the afternoon. The Seth Thomas clock above Judge Alderman read 4:20. Still 3 minutes ahead. Still uncorrected. I looked at it one last time before leaving the courtroom, and I thought about what Nathan had written in his notebook. Numbers are what I do. And these numbers do not agree. His numbers had found their audience. Tomorrow the defense would speak, but tonight, in the silence of my kitchen, I would wind the Hamilton, set it to the correct time, and wait for the last wheel to turn. The defense lasted 2 days. Philip Crane called 4 witnesses, each one carefully chosen to suggest that Victor Stahl was a competent physician who had made reasonable clinical decisions based on the information available to him. A cardiologist from Dartmouth testified that warfarin dosing is more art than science, that individual patient responses vary widely, and that incremental adjustments are standard practice. A pharmacist from Rutland testified that the dosage records in Nathan's case fell within an acceptable range when viewed in isolation. A former colleague of Victor's testified to his professional reputation. A character witness testified to Diane's dedication as a nurse and a wife. Catherine Alcott listened to each witness with her hands folded on the table. She did not interrupt. She did not shake her head. She waited, the way a clockmaker waits for a movement to finish its cycle before measuring the amplitude. When her turn came for cross-examination, she asked each witness the same question in different forms. Had they reviewed the footage from the cabin? Had they heard Victor and Diane discuss the coagulation window? Had they seen Victor point to the medical chart and trace the dosage escalation with his finger, while Diane identified the section of trail where rescue would arrive too late? Each witness said yes. Each witness had nothing further to add. On the 9th day, both sides delivered closing arguments. Philip Crane spoke for 37 minutes. He used the word reasonable 14 times. He asked the jury to consider the possibility that 2 people who appeared to be planning a crime on camera were in fact discussing a hypothetical scenario, a dark conversation between 2 medical professionals who understood mortality and sometimes spoke about it in clinical terms. He said grief distorts perception. He said a father's pain can turn ordinary footage into evidence of conspiracy. He said reasonable doubt is the foundation of justice. Catherine spoke for 26 minutes. She began with Nathan's notebook. She read the August 2nd entry one more time, slowly, letting each word fill the courtroom the way a single note fills a concert hall when the orchestra has gone silent. I do not want to accuse anyone, but I am a pharmacist. Numbers are what I do, and these numbers do not agree. Then she set the notebook down and said, Nathan Bellamy was not a grieving father looking for someone to blame. Nathan Bellamy was a scientist who found an anomaly in his own blood and documented it with the precision of a man who understood that numbers do not lie. He did not live long enough to ask the question. But the question is here now, in this courtroom, written in his own hand, and it deserves an answer. She turned to the evidence table, the notebook, the thumb drive, the insurance documents, the medical board complaint from 2017, the toxicology report from the state laboratory in Burlington confirming that Nathan's stored blood samples showed a warfarin concentration consistent with 7 milligrams sustained over 11 weeks, not the 5 milligrams his weight and history required. 5 objects on a table, each one a gear and a mechanism that had taken months to assemble, but only seconds to understand once you saw how the pieces fit together. This is not a case about grief, Catherine said. This is a case about design. Diane Bellamy and Victor Stahl designed a system. They tested it in 2017 on George Harmon, and it worked. They refined it in 2023 and applied it to Nathan Bellamy. The method was the same. The drug was the same. The physician was the same. The only difference was the amount of money and the name on the death certificate. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 41 minutes. I know the exact duration because I timed it on the Hamilton, watching the second hand complete its circuit again and again while I sat on a wooden bench in the hallway outside the courtroom. Frank sat beside me. He did not speak. He held a paper cup of coffee that he never drank, and every 20 minutes he would look at the cup, consider it, and set it back on the bench. We had known each other for 30 years, and we had reached the age where silence between friends is not absence but presence. The clock ticks. The hands move. The room is full even when no one speaks. At 4:53 in the afternoon, the bailiff opened the door and called us back inside. The jury had reached a verdict. I stood up. My knees protested the way old knees do, with a stiffness that reminds you of every year you have carried. Frank steadied me with a hand on my elbow, not because I needed it, but because that is what friends do when the moment is large and the body is small. The foreperson was the woman from the front row, the one who had pressed her hand to her mouth on the day the footage played. She stood with a single sheet of paper and read the verdict in a voice that did not waver. Diane Bellamy, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Nathan Bellamy. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of insurance fraud. Victor Stahl, guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Nathan Bellamy. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of medical fraud. I heard the words the way you hear a clock strike the hour when you have been waiting for it all day. You know it is coming. You have counted every minute. But when the sound arrives, it fills a space inside you that you did not know was empty. Diane did not move. She sat with her hands flat on the defense table, perfectly still, staring straight ahead at a point on the wall behind the judge. Victor lowered his head. His shoulders dropped. His hands trembled in his lap, and I recognized the tremor. It was the same tremor I had felt in my own hands the night I stood on the cabin porch and heard the pendulum ticking through the door. The tremor of a man whose mechanism has finally stopped. Sentencing was scheduled for April. Judge Alderman thanked the jury, struck the gavel once, and the Seth Thomas clock above his bench marked the moment at 4:57. 3 minutes fast. It had been 3 minutes fast since the first day of the trial, and no one had corrected it. But it no longer mattered. The time that mattered was not on that clock. It was in Nathan's notebook, in his blood, in the footage, in the careful handwriting of a man who measured everything and trusted that the numbers would eventually speak for themselves. Frank drove me home. I sat in the passenger seat with the Hamilton in my palm, its case warm from 9 days against my chest. The second hand was still moving. The balance wheel was still turning, and somewhere inside the mechanism, in a place too small to see without a loop, the jewels were holding steady, absorbing the shock of every tick, so the movement could continue without damage. That is what jewels do in a watch. They bear the impact, so the rest can keep running. Diane was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Victor received 22 years. Judge Alderman delivered both sentences on the 14th of April, a Tuesday, at 10:11 in the morning. I sat in the same seat I had occupied for 9 days in February, wearing the same gray suit, watching the same Seth Thomas clock above the bench. Someone had finally corrected it. The time was exact. I checked it against the Hamilton in my pocket, and for the first time in this courtroom, the two clocks agreed. Diane stood when the sentence was read. She did not speak. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Judge Alderman the way a patient keeps their eyes on a surgeon who is about to deliver a diagnosis they already know. When the bailiff guided her toward the side door, she walked with the same posture she had carried through the entire trial. Straight back. Steady steps. No visible fracture. I had seen movements like that in watches brought to me for repair. The exterior pristine, the dial clean, the hands moving at what appeared to be the correct rate. But inside, the mainspring was cracked. The tension was gone. The movement was coasting on residual energy, and within hours it would stop completely. Victor wept. He wept the way men weep who have held themselves rigid for months and can no longer sustain the architecture. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. Victor did not acknowledge it. He sat with his face in his hands while the courtroom emptied. And I watched him for 11 seconds before I stood and walked toward the door. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel triumph. I felt the particular stillness that comes after a clock has been fully wound and set. The work is finished. The mechanism is running. What it measures from this point forward is no longer in your hands. Frank was waiting in the hallway. He looked at me and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "What now?" "Art." I told him I was going to build a clock. The idea had come to me during the trial, somewhere between Catherine's closing argument and the jury's deliberation. It arrived the way most of my ideas arrive. Not as a sudden flash, but as a slow accumulation. Like dust settling on a workbench, until one morning you notice the shape it has taken. Nathan and I had built the cabin together over 3 summers. We had built the workshop together. We had built a tradition of stopping the pendulum clock when someone in the family died, but we had never built a clock together. That was the one project we had talked about for years and never started, always postponing it for the next visit, the next summer, the next long weekend that never came. I drove to the cabin the following Saturday. The road was different in April. The snow had retreated to the highest elevations, and the lower slopes were brown and wet, the color of earth remembering how to breathe after months of being held. The birches were beginning to bud. Small green points along every branch, each one a promise that required nothing but time and warmth to keep. The workshop was cold but dry. I opened the door, turned on the single overhead light, and stood in the middle of the room where Nathan's drafting notes still hung on the wall. His handwriting, his calculations, his pencil marks, some firm, some faint, tracing the shapes of things he had imagined but not yet made. I left them where they were. They would stay on that wall for as long as the wall stood. I cleared the main workbench. I laid out my tools in the order I have always used. Left to right, smallest to largest, each one in its place. Tweezers, pinviezen, juweling tool, mainspring winder, timing machine. I had not arranged them in this configuration since before Nathan died, and the act of placing each tool in its position felt like setting the hour markers on a new dial. You are not just marking time, you are defining the space where time will be measured. The clock I wanted to build was a pendulum clock. Not a replica of the Seth Thomas in the courtroom or the family clock in the cabin. Something new. A movement designed from the beginning to be accurate, durable, and open. I wanted a skeleton design where every gear, every wheel, every jewel is visible through the front of the case. Nothing hidden. Nothing sealed behind a closed door. A clock that shows its entire mechanism to anyone who cares to look, because I had learned over the past 5 months that the most dangerous machines are the ones you cannot see inside. I began with the escapement. The escapement is the heart of any mechanical clock. It is the component that converts the continuous force of the mainspring into discrete, measured intervals. Without it, the spring would simply unwind in a single burst, and the hands would spin forward without meaning. The escapement is what gives a clock its voice. Tick, release. Tick, release. Tick, release. A controlled interruption that transforms raw energy into time. I worked for 6 hours that first day. I did not eat. I drank water from a bottle I had brought in my coat pocket. The workshop warmed slowly from my presence and the single light overhead. And by late afternoon, the temperature was comfortable enough that I removed my jacket and worked in my shirt sleeves, the way I used to work in the shop in Bennington when a repair demanded my full attention and the world outside the window ceased to exist. By evening, I had roughed out the escape wheel and begun shaping the pallets. The work was slow and deliberate, each cut measured twice, each surface filed to within a tolerance that most people would call unnecessary, but that any watchmaker would call minimum. Nathan would have understood. He had the same instinct for precision, the same inability to leave a surface unfinished or a measurement unapproved. It was the thing that made him a good pharmacist and a good son, and the kind of man who checked his own blood because the numbers did not agree. I locked the workshop at 7:15. The sky was dark and the stars were out. More stars than you ever see in town. The kind of sky that makes you feel both small and certain at the same time. I stood beside the truck and looked up for a long time. Somewhere behind me, inside the cabin, the family pendulum clock was still ticking. I had not stopped it again after the trial. I had wound it myself on my last visit, set it to the correct time, and let it run. The tradition said you stop the clock when someone dies, but no tradition tells you when to start it again. That decision belongs to the living. And I had decided. The clock took me 4 months to build. I drove to the cabin every Saturday and worked from 8 in the morning until the light faded, which in April meant 7 in the evening, and by August meant almost 9. I shaped each gear by hand, from brass stock I ordered from a supplier in Connecticut. The same supplier my father had used when he taught me the trade in 1971. The brass arrived, wrapped in brown paper, and each time I unwrapped a new sheet, I thought of the 5 pocket watches I had mailed to Victor. Each one wrapped the same way, each one carrying a time he could not escape. But those watches had been weapons. This clock was something else. This clock was a conversation with my son that I had waited too long to start. I finished the escapement in May, the gear train in June, the winding mechanism in July. Each component was built to be visible through the open frame, every tooth and pivot and jewel exposed to anyone who stood in front of it. I had chosen cherry wood for the case, harvested from a tree that had fallen behind the cabin during a storm in 2019. Nathan had helped me mill the planks that autumn, running each board through the table saw while I guided the fence, both of us wearing ear protection and communicating through hand signals, the private language of men working together in loud rooms. The wood had been drying in the workshop ever since, waiting for a purpose it did not yet have. Now it had one. In August, I began assembling the final clock. I fitted the movement into the cherry case on a Saturday afternoon, while rain fell against the workshop roof, in a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular. The irregularity bothered me in the way only a watchmaker would be bothered, and I smiled at myself for noticing. Nathan would have noticed too. He would have said something about it. Some quiet observation about how nature almost keeps time but never quite commits. And I would have laughed, and the sound of our laughter would have mixed with the rain the way 2 frequencies mix when they are close enough to harmonize but different enough to remain distinct. I hung the pendulum on the 23rd of August. The same date Nathan had written his second INR reading in the leather notebook. 4.3. I did not choose the date deliberately. I realized the coincidence only after I had already set the pendulum swinging and heard the first tick fill the workshop. But coincidence is just a word we use when we are not yet ready to call something meaningful. A watchmaker knows that every alignment has a cause, even if the cause is invisible. The clock ran true from the first day. I checked it against the Hamilton every morning for 2 weeks, and the deviation never exceeded 1.4 seconds per day. For a handmade pendulum clock built in a mountain workshop by a 68-year-old man with grief in his hands, that was more than acceptable. That was precise. I mounted the clock on the wall of the cabin's main room, beside the window that looks out over the valley. The family pendulum clock hung on the opposite wall, still running, still ticking in the rhythm it had kept for decades. Now there were 2 clocks in the room, 2 heartbeats. One belonged to the history of this family, and one belonged to its future. And between them the air vibrated with a patience that I had spent my whole life trying to understand. In October, I opened the cabin to visitors for the first time. Frank had suggested it months earlier, during one of our long phone conversations that always began with a practical question and ended with something closer to philosophy. He said the cabin was too important to hold one man's grief. He said Nathan would have wanted it used. I resisted at first, the way you resist any change to a space that still holds the shape of someone you have lost. But Frank was right, and I knew it, and knowing it was enough to begin. I called the program Horology for Healing. The name came to me while I was adjusting the tension on the new clock's mainspring, turning the arbor a quarter rotation at a time until the amplitude steadied. Horology is the study of time. Healing is what happens when you stop trying to reverse it and learn instead to measure it honestly. The program invited people who had experienced loss to come to the cabin for a weekend and learn the basics of clock repair. Not therapy, not counseling, just the slow, focused, mechanical work of taking something broken and making it run again. The first group arrived on the second Saturday of October. 7 people. A woman who had lost her husband to cancer. A man who had lost his daughter in a car accident. A veteran named Marcus, 29, who had lost 3 friends in a place he did not want to name. 2 sisters who had lost their mother. A retired teacher who had lost her sense of purpose and said so plainly, without embarrassment, the way you state a fact that no longer has the power to shame you. They sat at the workbench I had cleared, and I placed a broken pocket watch in front of each of them. You do not need to know how this works, I told them. You just need to be willing to open it and look inside. They opened the cases. They peered at the movements through the loops I provided. They asked questions. They made mistakes. They stripped a screw. They dropped a spring. They laughed at themselves and at each other, and the laughter filled the workshop the way the ticking of the new clock filled the cabin, steady and imperfect and alive. By the end of the weekend, 4 of the 7 had reassembled their watches to working condition. The other 3 had not. But they carried the pieces home in small cloth bags I had sewn from leftover fabric. And 2 of them called me within the month to say they had finished at their kitchen tables, alone, at night, with the house quiet, and their hands finally steady enough to set the balance wheel spinning. I still drive to the cabin every Saturday. The road is familiar now in a way it was not before. Not just as a route, but as a rhythm. 9 miles of gravel that my truck knows by memory. The workshop smells of clock oil and cherry wood, and the particular stillness that lives in rooms where careful work is done. The skeleton clock on the cabin wall runs true. The family pendulum runs beside it. 2 movements. 2 voices. 2 measures of the same unbroken hour. Nathan's leather notebook sits in the top drawer of my workbench, beneath a clean cloth, beside the Hamilton. I do not read it anymore. I do not need to. The words are part of me now, carried in the same place where I carry the sound of his laughter, the weight of his hand on my shoulder, the memory of a boy who grew into a man who trusted numbers and wrote them down because he believed that truth, once recorded, cannot be erased. He was right. Time does not heal. That is something people say when they do not know what else to offer. What time does is measure. It counts the distance between what was and what is. And if you are patient enough and precise enough, it shows you where the break occurred so you can build something in its place. Not a replacement, never a replacement, but something new that ticks beside the silence and gives it a name.